Today I'm going to show you the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So the functional areas of the cerebral cortex can be classified based on its function, as I've explained during the lecture, and it can also be classified based on its location. Example, which lobes they are located in: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. So firstly, let's have a look at the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe, it is anterior to the central sulcus. So here is central sulcus. Here is central sulcus. So anterior to central sulcus, here is the frontal lobe. So functional areas of the cerebral cortex in the frontal lobe, you'll find there's the motor cortex. And then there's the Broca area and the prefrontal cortex. Let's have a look at the motor cortex first. So the motor cortex involves the primary motor cortex, the supplementary motor area, the premotor cortex, and the frontal eye field. Let's have a look at the primary motor cortex first. So primary motor cortex, it is in the precentral gyrus. So this is central sulcus. Anterior to that is the precentral gyrus. The posterior part of the precentral gyrus is where you'll find the primary motor cortex. Correspond to Brodmann's area 4. And it extends to the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Into the anterior part of the paracentral lobule. So this is the paracentral lobule. This is central sulcus, this is paracentral lobule. It extends, the primary motor cortex extends to the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere into the anterior part of the paracentral lobule. Okay? So I'll orientate the cerebrum for you first. So this is anterior, this is posterior. Okay, so this is the paracentral lobule on the medial surface of the cerebral cortex. So anterior to the paracentral lobule, here you'll find the supplementary motor area. It is in the medial frontal gyrus, correspond to Brodmann's area 6. So that is supplementary motor area anterior to the paracentral lobule. Okay, now let's have a look at the premotor cortex, also known as premotor area. It's on the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, again I'll orientate yourself. So this is anterior, this is posterior, superior, inferior. Okay, this is central sulcus, precentral gyrus. Okay, and the premotor cortex, you'll find it anterior to the primary motor cortex. So it is in the anterior part of the precentral gyrus and posterior part of the superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so that's the premotor cortex, corresponds to most of the Brodmann's area 6. Now let's have a look at the frontal eye field. Frontal eye field is located anterior to the premotor cortex in the middle frontal gyrus. So around here, frontal eye field correspond to parts of Brodmann area 6, 8, 9. Okay, and anterior to the premotor cortex and frontal eye field in the anterior part of the frontal lobe, there's the prefrontal cortex. Okay, prefrontal cortex on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and also on the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and also on the medial surface of the here frontal lobe. Okay, so that's the prefrontal cortex. Okay, now let's have a look at the Broca area. So Broca area you'll find in the inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, inferior frontal gyrus in the triangular part and opercular part of the inferior frontal gyrus. So that's Broca area, correspond to Brodmann area 45 and 44. Okay, so these are the functional areas that you can find in the frontal lobe. Now let's have a look at the parietal lobe. So parietal lobe, it is posterior to the central sulcus. Again, this is the central sulcus. Posterior to that, you'll find the parietal lobe. Okay, let's have, in the parietal lobe, you'll find there's the somatosensory cortex, and there's the taste cortex, and you'll also find there's the vestibular cortex. Okay, so firstly, let's have a look at the somatosensory cortex. That consists of primary somatosensory cortex, secondary somatosensory cortex, and somatosensory association area. Okay, so the primary somatosensory cortex lies in the post-central gyrus. Okay, post-central gyrus, and it extends onto the medial surface in the posterior part of the paracentral lobule. Okay, in the posterior part of the paracentral lobule. Okay, so the primary somatosensory cortex corresponds to Brodmann's area 312. Okay, and then the secondary somatosensory cortex, it is hidden in the lateral fissure, in the upper bank of the lateral fissure. So if you open up the lateral fissure, so it is in the upper bank of the lateral fissure, extending posteriorly towards the insula. So that's the secondary somatosensory cortex. Okay. Now, the somatosensory association cortex is posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. So this is primary somatosensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus. Posterior to that, here in the superior parietal lobule is the somatosensory association cortex, correspond to Brodmann area 5 and 7. Okay, and then there's the taste cortex. Taste cortex you'll find at the inferior end of the postcentral gyrus. Here, inferior end of postcentral gyrus, correspond to Brodmann area 43, is the taste cortex. And then in the parietal lobe, you'll also find vestibular cortex. There are several areas in the cerebral cortex that receive vestibular information, and they are called the vestibular cortex. Firstly, there's the parieto-insular vestibular cortex, but it's not present in this model. Okay, I'll show you a different model first. Okay, so let's have a look at this model here. Parieto-insular vestibular cortex. So it's in the insula, the posterior part of the insula. This is lateral fissure. Open the lateral fissure and see the insula inside the posterior part of the insula. And this is called the parieto-insular vestibular cortex. Okay? Okay, another region that receives vestibular information is the area 2V. Area 2V, so again anterior, posterior. Area 2V is at the anterior tip, at the tip of the intraparietal sulcus. This is intraparietal sulcus. At the tip of intraparietal sulcus is the area 2V. Also receive vestibular information. And another area that receives the vestibular information, another region that receives vestibular information is the area 3AV. Area 3AV is in the central sulcus. So this is central sulcus. In the central sulcus, near the neck representation area, around here. Okay. So that is the functional areas that you'll find in the parietal lobe. Now let's have a look at the occipital lobe. Okay, in the occipital lobe, you'll find the visual cortex. Okay, visual cortex consists of primary visual cortex and visual association cortex. The primary visual cortex, mostly you'll find it on the medial surface of the occipital lobe. The medial surface of the occipital lobe, and it is posterior to the calcarine sulcus, on the superior part and the inferior part of the posterior calcarine sulcus. So this is the posterior calcarine sulcus. Okay, superior wall of the posterior part of the calcarine sulcus involves the cuneus, and inferior wall of the posterior part of calcarine sulcus involves the lingual gyrus. Okay, so this is the primary visual cortex, correspond to Brodmann area 17, and it extends to a small part posterolaterally. Brodmann area 17, primary visual cortex extends small part posterolaterally around the tip of the calcarine sulcus here. Okay, so that's the primary visual cortex. The visual association cortex that consists of secondary and tertiary visual cortex. It surrounds the primary visual cortex. So it surrounds the primary visual cortex. So you'll find it on the lateral surface of the occipital lobe and also the medial surface of the occipital lobe surrounding the primary visual cortex. The primary visual cortex is near the posterior part of the calcarine sulcus, and surrounding the primary visual cortex you'll find the visual association cortex up to the parieto-occipital sulcus here, and the visual association cortex involves the secondary and tertiary visual cortex that corresponds to Brodmann's area 18 and 19. Okay, around here. Okay, so that's the functional area in the occipital lobe. Now let's have a look at functional area in the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe. Okay, you'll find the functional areas in the temporal lobe. There's the auditory cortex, and then there's the Wernicke area, and also there's the olfactory cortex. Okay, firstly let's have a look at the auditory cortex. Auditory cortex, it is hidden in the lateral fissure. Okay, it is in the hidden in the lateral fissure. It is in the posterior superior part of the superior temporal gyrus. This is superior temporal gyrus. Here is the posterior superior part of the superior temporal gyrus in the transverse temporal gyri of Hassel. Okay, so that's the primary auditory cortex that correspond to Brodmann's area 22 and 42. Okay, now let's have a look at the auditory association cortex. Auditory association cortex, it is in the non-dominant cerebral hemisphere, which is commonly, the non-dominant cerebral hemisphere is commonly the right cerebral hemisphere. 95% of the, most commonly the non-dominant cerebral hemisphere is the right cerebral hemisphere. So this is left cerebral hemisphere. So the auditory association cortex is most commonly in the right cerebral hemisphere. Okay, and it surrounds the primary auditory cortex. Okay, so primary auditory cortex is hidden in the lateral fissure in the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus. This is superior temporal gyrus. Okay, this is anterior, this is posterior, this is superior temporal gyrus. On the superior posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus, you'll find the transverse temporal gyri of Hassel, the primary auditory cortex. So the auditory association cortex surrounds the primary auditory cortex. So you'll find the auditory association cortex in the superior temporal gyrus in the posterior part. Okay, of the it is in the superior temporal gyrus. Okay, sorry, it is in the superior temporal gyrus, the auditory association cortex in the superior temporal gyrus, and it corresponds to Brodmann's area 22 and part of Brodmann area 42. Okay, so this is in the non-dominant cerebral hemisphere. In the dominant cerebral hemisphere, this region where the auditory association cortex is, in the dominant hemisphere, it is the Wernicke area. In the dominant hemisphere, most commonly the left cerebral hemisphere, that region, the region of the auditory association cortex on the dominant hemisphere is the Wernicke area. Okay, so here, so this is anterior, this is posterior, this is lateral fissure, this is superior temporal gyrus. In the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus, corresponding to Brodmann's area 22, most of the part of the Brodmann's area 22 is the Wernicke area, including the here supramarginal gyrus, Brodmann area 40, and angular gyrus. Here, angular gyrus, Brodmann area 39. Okay, so this is the Wernicke area. Okay, posterior part of superior temporal gyrus, angular gyrus, supramarginal gyrus forms the Wernicke area. Okay. Okay, another functional area in the temporal lobe is the olfactory cortex. Olfactory cortex, you'll find it on the inferior surface of the temporal lobe. Here, it is here. It involves the piriform region and periamygdaloid region, part of the piriform cortex. So this is the olfactory cortex. Okay, so that's all for the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. And I forgot to mention to you that Broca area also, it is on the dominant cerebral hemisphere, which is most commonly the left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so this is left cerebral hemisphere. This is Broca area in the inferior frontal gyrus. Broca area, most commonly, Broca area, you'll find it in the dominant cerebral hemisphere, which is most commonly the left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, thank you.